Hi, everybody. Well, like the rest of 2020, the Atlantic hurricane season hurled one storm right after the other at us. And even though longtime records were falling all around us and we thought we had seen it all, well, the Atlantic hurricane season had more tricks up its sleeve. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our live coverage and our live look back at the unprecedented 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. I'm MyRadar's Chief Meteorologist, Leslie Hudson, and joining me is Meteorologist Stefanie Lauber, as well as Meteorologist Mike Linden.
What's going on, everybody? We also want to remind you to get social with us. We are live across all of those platforms, but you can see all the handles right there at the bottom of the screen. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so be sure to follow us there, especially as things start to ramp up into 2021.
And we're also on YouTube, so make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell to make sure you never miss a video whenever we drop one.
Coming up, we are going to take a look at how the COVID-19 pandemic affected hurricane forecasting. You can see our socially distanced sets here and the emergency messages for the public. Plus, we'll talk to MyRadar storm chaser Aaron Jajak about his most memorable storm chases of the 2020 season.
But first, why was this Atlantic hurricane season so busy? Why were so many records falling? Well, I sat down with the NOAA Climate Prediction Center's lead meteorologist, as well as a hurricane special from the National Hurricane Center to try and unpack this and find some answers. Thank you for joining us. As you know, Tropical Storm Faye, if you live in the Hurricane Isaias. My name is Hannah. Developed
Hurricane Laura.
Hurricane Laura. It literally made landfall within the last 2 minutes. So officially, Delta has made landfall over Creole. Hurricane's data made landfall as a Category 2 hurricane, winds at 110 miles an hour. As we close the books on the 2020 hurricane season, trying to find the right adjective to describe it is tough. The season alone left most of us, well, breathless.
It seemed like for us who were putting out these advisories, working with each storm, we'd have a storm hit, and you had no time to catch your breath, and you were already worried about the next 1, 2, or even 3. I mean, I think at one point in September, we had 5 storms going in the Atlantic all at once. So it was almost like a marathon. We just didn't have time to rest, didn't have time to catch our breath. One storm was done, and it was right on to the next one.
From Arthur to Wilfred, then on to Alpha, and then eventually Iota, this year had it all. And boy, was it ever so in line with a year like 2020.
Well, what struck out to me was not a particular storm, but the fact that we had so many late season storms, several of them forming in the Western Caribbean between even mid to late October and well into November. And typically you just don't see that number of storms because conditions are just getting less and less favorable as time goes on.
The 2020 hurricane season got off to an early yet electric pace. There was a record 9 named storms from May through July alone, and it didn't take long to exhaust the 21 name Atlantic list when Tropical Storm Wilfred came calling in mid-September.
Well, it's an extremely active season. It set the record for the number of named storms, 30 in a season. It also set a record for 12 landfalling storms in the United States, and it set another record for 5 consecutive above normal seasons.
For only the second time in history, the Greek alphabet was used for the remainder of the season using 9 of the Greek letters. All told, there were 30 named tropical storms, 13 hurricanes, 6 of those becoming major hurricanes with winds greater than 111 miles an hour. 12 of those named storms hit the continental U.S., shattering the old record that stood since 1916. So why in the world was this year so busy?
Well, the overriding main factor is a climate pattern called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. This is a well-known climate pattern, and it produces periods of increased activity from anywhere from 25 to 40 years at a time, followed by periods of decreased activity. We're in an increased or a high activity era since 1995. That pattern is associated with warmer Atlantic Ocean temperatures, weaker wind shear, much more favorable winds coming off of Africa. So it produces a whole set of conditions that make for more, stronger, and longer lasting storms. Now this year, another climate pattern was also in place, La Nina. It's a Pacific Ocean climate phenomenon, and it's important for the Atlantic hurricanes because it further acts to reduce the wind shear. So when you have this combination of climate factors, that really sets you up for the potential for an extremely active season.
This is the 5th consecutive year with an above normal Atlantic hurricane season, with 18 above normal seasons out of the past 26. 2020 also marks the 5th season we've seen a Category 5 hurricane form in the Atlantic Basin. But there's no record of a Category 5 forming as late in the season as Hurricane Iota. It slammed into Nicaragua in mid-November.
If a storm gets in the Gulf of Mexico, it's 100% going to make landfall.
Yes.
Where exactly that the storms track, that just kind of depends on the steering currents. And sometimes you can get locked into a certain pattern that we saw this year that brought the storms up to Louisiana versus, say, a little bit farther east. And we saw a similar locking in of the conditions in November with those two major hurricanes that struck Nicaragua, one right next to the other, making landfall within about 15 miles apart. Just absolutely amazing.
More than 435 people were killed during the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, with an estimated $41 billion price tag in damages. So what's the climate link to this historic season? La Nina. La Nina almost always means a busier than normal hurricane season, as environmental conditions are primed for more tropical cyclones to form. During La Nina, westerly winds high in the atmosphere weaken. This means an expanded area of low vertical wind shear, allowing more Atlantic hurricanes to develop during a La Nina year. La Nina also increases the number of hurricanes that develop and allows stronger hurricanes to form.
Well, the conditions we saw this year are very typical of other extremely active seasons, and pretty much we saw these same types of conditions back in 2005, which is we're mentioning that because it's the strongest hurricane season on record.
Yes.
There again, we had La Nina developing later in the season, but we also had this warm phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And again, that set the stage for a lot of activity. But one thing that's also we saw this year and back in 2005 was a big ridge of high pressure over the eastern United States, extending down into the western Caribbean. And when you get that makes it even more favorable for storms to get closer to the Caribbean and to the United States, and that greatly increases the threat of hurricane landfalls.
2005 is the only other hurricane season that can even get into the running with the 2020 hurricane season. In that year, there were 28 named storms, 15 becoming hurricanes, 9 storms made landfall in the U.S. It cost over $100 billion in damages. It wasn't just above the ground, but also in the ocean, where NOAA captured critical data from this unprecedented year. 3 hurricanes, Isaias, Laura, and Sally, passed within range of NOAA's hurricane ocean gliders this year. They captured invaluable ocean data below the storms, while Hurricane Hunter airplanes captured atmospheric data above. On top of the sheer volume of storms this year, this hurricane season saw more record water levels too. Hurricane Laura pushed an estimated 17-foot wall of water onto parts of Louisiana's coast, putting Laura in the record books as one of the top 10 storm surges along the Gulf Coast. Later in the season, Hurricane Sally brought the highest water level since Hurricane Katrina in 2005 to Pensacola, Florida. The official surge, over 6.5 feet. Sally's storm surge was a top 5 record for the Florida Panhandle.
Historically, these periods of increased and then subsequently decreased activity, historically they last about 25 to 40 years. So we're now 26 years into this high activity era. At least as of now, there's been no indication at all that we're getting out of it. In fact, the last 5 hurricane seasons were above normal. And basically the conditions we're seeing now, very favorable for storms, are what we saw back in 1995. So this this pattern has not ended, but there's really no way to predict how long it will last. So we just really don't know. What's important is that not only are we seeing more storms in this high activity area, but so many more millions of people are now Atlantic and Gulf Coast residents. So that every time a storm threatens, so many more millions of people are potentially impacted.
With millions of people flocking to our shores year after year, the tropical impacts will only go up from here. But there are silver linings among these storm clouds. And at the end of the day, it comes down to taking the time to prepare now and not when it's too late.
Once a storm is approaching, it's often too late. It's very difficult to start preparing as a major hurricane's approaching and you're in panic mode. No, wrong time. Instead, get prepared ahead of time, know your plan so that you're ready to act if needed.
Okay, you guys, we just want to remind you that some of the video that we had in that story was actually attributed to Hurricane Sally and Pensacola Beach, Florida, and we actually incorrectly were showing parts of Alabama and Louisiana. We are aware of the mistake. We couldn't get it corrected before we went live today, but we will make sure to correct that video. So if you capture that, make sure we will get that corrected and show it to you. But we also want to encourage you guys. We see a few questions on YouTube, but please post a comment right now. In a few minutes, we're going to be answering your questions live, and we would love to get some feedback from you guys. If you lived through one of the tropical storms or one of the hurricanes this year, let us know what you went through and we will talk about it in just a few minutes. And again, if you have a question, please ask those as well. Mike?
Leslie, it's not the record number of storms that proved to be the biggest takeaway for Colorado State University researcher Phil Klotzbach. I talked to him about what made 2020 a truly unique hurricane season. The 2020 hurricane season didn't sneak up on anyone as the eyes of the weather world waited for the storms to pop. And boy, did they.
Through September, we'd had 23 storms, which is way above average, even above 2005 levels. But we'd only had 2 major hurricanes. So there was a lot of talk, well, there's been a lot of quantity, but not much quality. Well, since October 1st, we've had 7 more storms. 4 of those hit major hurricane. We almost had a 5th with Zeta. It was really close, just below it was 110 miles an hour. It needs to be 111. So we almost had 5 major hurricanes. We had 4. The most we had in any prior October and November was 2.
That's Phil Klotzbach, a research scientist in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. Perhaps the most prolific tweeter in the tropical weather world, Klotzbach and his team at CSU release a seasonal forecast each year with a breakdown of expectations, number of storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes, and more. Going into a year with comparisons to the historic 2005 season, most of the indicators Klotzbach measures confirmed his thoughts about the season ahead.
There's clues. The atmosphere provides clues. The ocean provides clues. There's precursor signals that kind of basically load the dice to an above average season or below average season. In June and July, normally storm activity then doesn't really tell you that much about the rest of the season. But if you get storm activity in the deep tropics, so say south in the actual tropics, so south of 23.5 north, that's typically a harbinger of a very active season.
Before Category 1 Hurricane Hannah, the Atlantic saw 7 tropical storms, 2 of which formed in the deep tropics, Tropical Storms Cristobal and Gonzalo. We had to wait until August for the first major hurricane, that's Category 3 and above, for Category 4 Hurricane Laura. From there, things really started to ramp up.
We almost had 5 major hurricanes. We had 4. The most we had in any prior October and November was 2. So we broke that record by a long shot, and just, the storms seemingly as we went later and later in the season, they got stronger and stronger, with Eta reaching Cat 4, and then we had Iota, which actually did hit a Category 5, but the latest Category 5 in the Atlantic on record.
Measuring storms and identifying their quality is done through a metric called ACE, Accumulated Cyclone Energy. While ACE doesn't reveal everything there is to know about a storm, it tells forecasters like Klotzbach a lot about how powerful they really are.
That's an index that takes into account the frequency, but especially the intensity and the duration of storms. So storms that are weak and short-lived generate very little ACE. Storms that are strong and long-lived generate tremendous amounts of ACE.
If there was a silver lining to this season, that's it. It's the lack of quality versus the quantity of storms we saw.
This year we didn't actually have one huge ACE generator because none of the storms that were particularly strong were very long lasting. However, if you go back to like 2017, Hurricane Irma, which I'm sure most people remember, extremely long-lived, very intense, of Category 5 for a couple of days. That storm generated a tremendous amount of ACE. This year we just had so many dang storms that the ACE values did get really high, but that's just because we had so much quantity, and then we did, especially late in the season, also have, even though they weren't super long-lived, very intense storms. And the intense storms, even if they are short-lived, do generate reasonable amounts of ACE fairly quickly.
As tropical activity finally slows down, looking ahead to 2021 has already begun. But one of the biggest takeaways from this season wasn't the record number of storms, nor the timing of them, but the way the storms blew up.
ACE was a lot higher in 2005 than this year. We had 4 Category 5 hurricanes. Thankfully none of the storms this year are going to be as cataclysmic as Katrina was in 2005, but this thing about 2005 is even Katrina was weakening as it approached the coast. So this year we had so many storms rapidly intensifying up to or almost up to the point of landfall. And even if you look at those last 2 storms that went into Nicaragua, they weren't intensifying right up to the point of landfall, but within about 12 hours of landfall, they were going up quickly. So you had all these storms blowing up right on the doorstep of land. And typically some storms obviously land's what kills them, but a lot of times what kind of knocks the storms down as they encounter dry air, they encounter shear, and that's kind of what kills the storm. This year it was like all these storms were all systems go, and what basically caused the storm not to strengthen anymore was it hit land.
And when a hurricane is coming our way, the men and women who work in our emergency management offices are working tirelessly to keep people prepared for the storm. I got a chance to talk to the emergency manager of Orange County right here in Orlando, Florida, to see what they do to take preparations, as well as our partners at Flash, on what lessons we can take away from the 2020 season.
Turning to the last page of the calendar means hurricane season has come to a close, and in typical 2020 fashion, this hurricane season was intense.
You can't do anything to change that storm as it comes your way, but that human behavior, how we react and how we take control of it, it boils down to life and death, and right behind that is quality of life. What are we returning home to?
Our partners at Flash, the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, provide resources to help you and your family take charge of your disaster prep. And as we look back on this past season, there's one question that comes to mind. What do we do now that the season's over?
So the first step is to look back and find out what we learned. And frankly, we learned a great deal. And our primary mission is helping people prepare their family and their home. And so what was different this year? Well, first of all, this was the year where peace of mind was even harder to come by on an ordinary day, right? With the pandemic and the unprecedented challenges and all the uncertainty, that was the starting point.
I spoke with the emergency manager here in Orange County, Florida, to learn how local authorities navigated this season.
Were there any particular challenges that were posed in 2020 versus other years with COVID and everything?
In relation to the hurricane season, the social distancing that we had to prepare for this year was like no other year we've ever experienced. So as we were preparing to open our shelters, we had to make sure that we had more shelters. So just as an example, in Orange County, we have 42 schools, and we typically open 6 of them. We plan to open 6. This year, we plan to open 40 of them, just in case they were needed. So that's a significant increase of shelters.
If the hyperactive hurricane season of 2020 has taught us nothing else, it's that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But preparation itself looked a little different this year.
So we knew we had to step back and say, okay, this is not going to be an ordinary hurricane season with uncertainty that is our normal, right? So we did a survey in April and we asked people, okay, what are you doing differently? What are your needs? What do you need from us? And it was interesting, 66% of the people responding, we covered 10 states that are the highest return period for hurricanes. So the places you would expect, from Texas to Florida and on up the eastern seaboard. And we said, what is on your mind? What are you thinking about? Well, 7% more of a prior year expressed an intention to prepare, but they zeroed in on certain things that were emphasized by the pandemic. DIY, affordable DIY, the simpler the better, but they were willing to go a step further than in the past in preparing the actual home itself. So what we did is we took that information, we said, okay, what do we need to do differently?
Chief Avery says taking early action was a popular trend in Central Florida from the beginning of hurricane season and a major key to getting communities ready.
So I'll say with Orange County in general, we've seen people prepare much earlier. And I think a lot of that comes from our social media, our press conferences, our just pushing that information out to the public as early as possible. And this year, with all the storms, we actually saw the grocery stores emptying out earlier than I think we ever have. So that tells us a couple things. People are preparing sooner, and the messaging is working. So I have to give kudos to our communications teams that are getting that information out quickly and earlier because people are listening.
With Hurricane Laura that moved through southwestern Louisiana and the Lake Charles area in Beaumont, Texas, a lot of folks were reacting and taking action, and that was credited with the fewer amounts of deaths and injuries that were reported from that storm, even though it was a monster huge storm. So what do you think was really successful about getting the message to folks?
I think people knew that they had a handicap this year because of the pandemic, and because of that, the engagement level was just that much higher. Obviously, they were also more likely to be home where they could get the news, even if they're telecommuting for work, and they just paid very close attention. There was tremendous concern about sheltering. So people on two different levels. On the one hand, people prepared their homes, or they investigated their home. They looked up their building code on our website to see if their home was built to a modern code and it could be strong enough for them to stay inside. But they also worried about sheltering. If I'm going to go to a shelter, what do I need to do, to be safe from the pandemic?
These are the things your local emergency managers are already taking into account. They're planning ahead 24/7, 365.
A lot of people think emergency management is only about hurricanes, and there's so much more. Like, we've got the cold weather coming in tonight, so we're preparing to house our homeless people. But really, year round, we had a tornado in, I think it was June. There's flooding with the rain. So really, emergency management is more than just hurricane season. We are prepared and ready to respond year round.
In the end, that community effort ahead of a storm really pays off.
There are so many things you can do. No one has to be a victim. There are just things you can do, and they're within reach. And that's, I think, the most important message for the future.
COVID-19 caused a wealth of concern for the National Hurricane Center, not only in their forecasting, but in their ability to get that messaging out. I sat down and talked with hurricane specialist Robbie Berg with the National Hurricane Center to talk a little bit about this and how COVID-19 not only affected the forecasting, but also how it affected those advisories that are so critical to the public. Well, you guys, as we continue to try and dive deeper into the 2020 hurricane season, we are talking to the National Hurricane Center today. We're very fortunate that Robbie Berg from the National Hurricane Center has joined us today. He is a hurricane specialist with the NHC. And Robbie, first off, I think you all should get free trips to Hawaii after this year.
Well, that would be nice if the pandemic would end, then we could actually travel out there.
That's true. I didn't even think about that. Well, maybe in another couple of years, we'll have to send you guys off. It has been incredibly busy for the National Hurricane Center with our 30 named storms. Can you give me some of your impressions on this hurricane season?
Yeah, I mean, by any standards, this was a pretty hectic and crazy season for us just by the number of named storms. As you mentioned, we've had 30 in the Atlantic. And, you got to remember, too, for us, we also worry about storms in the Eastern Pacific. We had another 21 out there. So between the 21 out there and actually 31 in the Atlantic, because we had an unnamed depression, that's 52 active tropical cyclones that we had to issue advisories for. We were looking at some of the stats, and in the Atlantic in particular, on average, we issue probably about 320 advisories in any given season. We actually were close to 640 for this season, just in the Atlantic alone. So, I mean, it's almost double the number of advisories that we would normally issue in any given Atlantic season. So I think that right there just tells you how extremely busy we've been.
When you're talking about those kinds of numbers, and again, almost double what you would typically issue in an average season, that must put a strain on the staff. You're probably trying to bring in additional resources. I'm not sure. I know there's a finite amount of specialists and forecasters. So how did you combat this incredibly busy year?
Whenever we have a hurricane making landfall in the United States, we always bring in extra people to be at the hurricane center to help with that type of work. We have to put the advisories, we're looking at radar when the storm's getting close to land. We have the aircraft reconnaissance that we're watching. The problem this year is that with COVID, we couldn't have as many people in the building at one time as we normally would. So we actually had to start doing things where you'd have the core group of people that you needed at the center to put out those advisories, and then we would have other people remain at home but still provide those functions that were completely necessary to do during the storm. So we were still able to upstaff half the number of people we need. We just happened to keep people as separate as possible during these times.
I can imagine how that complicates things. We've talked to several agencies over these last 6 months on how do you get the messaging out to the public with COVID, and some of the obstacles and concerns were, people getting to shelters that could handle the restrictions with COVID, and getting the people far enough away from shore and far enough away from land, inland, it's where they were safe. And so I can imagine that just complicated the National Hurricane Center's protocols, trying to keep everything safe for you all, but it's still trying to get your important job out to the world and issuing these advisories.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a yes and no answer to that question, because in a forecast sense, nothing really changed. We still got the forecast out for every single storm, no delay, no problems whatsoever. I think what really changed is when we talk to our partners like FEMA and the emergency managers that live and work along the coast, how we talk to them may have changed a little bit. And because we had to account for these COVID-related issues, you can't just have a large-scale evacuation with the pandemic going on. But the emergency managers have to consider, okay, we have to evacuate people, but where do we put them? Do we have to have more shelters and so forth? So the messaging we did with our partners did have to change a little bit, because you have to change how you're reacting to these storms when they were approaching land.
And we talked to many emergency managers, local emergency managers, who echoed that same sentiment. It was a big concern how we would handle this year. And of course, this year was so busy, and there was several, I believe 12 named storms, and all told that hit the U.S., 5 in particular in Louisiana. Can we talk a little bit about that and some of the thinking behind this high number of storms that hit the U.S. and in particular Louisiana?
Yeah, a big thing is we've seen this in other hurricane seasons as well. Is sometimes you get these patterns locked in where storms just seem to take the same path over periods of time, over that same season. You think about 2005 was also another very active season, and a lot of those systems moved into the Gulf of Mexico and affected the same areas from Louisiana westward to Texas. We've had other hurricane seasons where the pattern is such that we still get a lot of storms, yet they all recurve out in the Atlantic, and here in the United States, we happen to be safe. But for whatever reason, the way the steering currents set up that particular year, we kept the storms offshore. This particular season, we just unfortunately seem to be in an active year, but then the pattern for the steering was such that we had 1 or 2 storms affect the east coast of the United States, and then a whole bunch of them hit the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and then moved up into the Gulf of Mexico. And so unfortunately, that's why we saw areas like Louisiana have to contend with 5 different storms. In fact, the entire Gulf Coast had 9 storms that had made landfall. If you look from Ada that hit the west coast of Tampa all the way around to Hannah, which hit South Texas. So it's just unfortunate the Gulf Coast just seemed to be the target for so many of these storms just because of how the steering pattern was for much of the season. What was so strange this year is how many storms formed at the end of the season and how strong they got. I mean, just Ada and Iota themselves in the Western Caribbean becoming major hurricanes, both in November, and then Iota becoming the latest forming Category 5 hurricane of any year. So, we can't really say why that happened. I think that's going to take some research after the fact. Maybe some bright kids in graduate school can take a look at that and see, what was so unique about this particular season that we had these strong storms at the end of the year.
Does the Hurricane Center, go through mid-season or at the end of season, take a look back and say, okay, this worked, this didn't work, this is what we're going to try next year?
That's a good question. I mean, we're always looking for ways to improve the messaging. A couple years ago, we introduced the key messages where we kind of want to boil down what's so important about a particular storm, and that's what we should focus on, or that's what we'd like people to focus on. For Laura in particular, that was an interesting one because I've heard, kind of the backroom talk that was going on during that storm, and you could feel it at the Hurricane Center. There was just so much concern with what that storm could do. And I think, some of the people when they were brainstorming, how do we message for the storm? And, words like unsurvivable got thrown out. And it's not something we want to take lightly. It's not something we want to use all the time. But when you're forecasting a 15 to 20 foot storm surge, frankly, it's unsurvivable. You cannot survive that. And not just the water coming up, but you're going to have the battering waves. And so the structures where you might be trying to shelter would just get totally destroyed. So, I think the staff there felt that, no, this is an instance where we have to be strong in our language and say that if you stay there along the coast and don't heed the evacuation orders, you may not make it out alive. We're glad we used that wording. We got a little bit of pushback after the storm for using that wording, but I think we're comfortable in using it because we think it saved lives. We didn't see the tremendous amount of loss of life that we've seen in other hurricanes.
Now, I also asked Robbie about the newly launched GO-16 and GO-17 satellites. He had a lot to say about that, and as well, a lot of other topics. You're going to want to make sure you get that entire interview. You can capture it on YouTube. We're going to post the entire video. He was great, so I hope you guys get a chance to watch it. Mike?
Leslie, we've been able to take you right into the storms this season thanks to MyRadar storm chaser Aaron Jajak. He's been out in the storms getting amazing up-close videos like this, and now he's joining us to talk about some of his most memorable storm chases of the 2020 hurricane season. I'm joined now by MyRadar storm chaser Aaron Jajak. Before we get started, Aaron, how was your holiday weekend?
It was fantastic. We kind of took it easy because we celebrated Canadian Thanksgiving in mid-October.
Hey, well, any way that you can celebrate in a year that has just been a really challenging one for many, many reasons. But hurricane season, a historic hurricane season, 2020 will go down in history for many, many reasons. But let's talk about hurricanes in general. For you, storm chasing is something that you're able to do throughout most of the year, but hurricane season is particular to one time of the year. What is the big difference for you when it comes to chasing something like a supercell or blizzard or something, I guess, some smaller scale compared to a massive scale, something like a hurricane? What's that like for you?
Yeah, so a couple of differences, mainly, I like to use the analogy that chasing supercells or tornadoes or really anything else, not so much blizzards, but supercells and tornadoes are more like a sprint. And chasing the hurricanes is more like a marathon. There's multiple days of lead time as you see where the storm is going to make landfall, and you can get there ahead of the storm and make a determination, scout areas of where's the best place to intercept that storm. And then there's, days after there's damage of that, you're documenting that damage afterwards. So that would be the main thing. And then obviously, the tornadoes, the supercells, they encompass a much smaller area than those hurricanes do.
So it has been an incredibly busy season for those, especially that live along the Gulf Coast. And you were able to chase for us, at least this season, both Laura and Zeta, a Greek alphabet storm. Unbelievable. Let's talk about Laura. Of course, right up until landfall, it was intensifying as you were, waiting for its arrival there. Take me through what that was like, considering landfall occurred incredibly early in the morning. I mean, it was really, really dark. What was that like for you as Laura made landfall and, of course, as the eye was right over top of you?
Yeah, so Laura looked like, to me, I thought it was going to be the big storm of the season, probably the strongest one, which it turns out it ended up being that. So I wanted to make sure I got down to the coast to get to that storm. The biggest concern going into that storm was where it looked like it was going to make landfall. And I was targeting the Lake Charles area to start. And all that area south of there along the Louisiana coast is very much swampland. Not really any road network, very low elevation. So surge is a major concern there when chasing hurricanes. It's not the ideal spot to intercept a hurricane. So, and then on top of it, you add the fact that it looked like it was going to be a night landfall. So I kind of went into this storm with a little bit of a different approach than I usually take. I usually try to stay more mobile so I can adjust as these storms wobble ashore. But with such a big storm and powerful storm, and with such a concern for surge in that low-lying area, I decided I was going to be a little bit safer this time. And I decided to stay more along the I-10 corridor and have a home base, if you will. I hunkered down in a hotel. I wanted to capture that human element. There were people there that had to evacuate. And so, I didn't really get with it being at night, you need light to be able to document these things, right? And so this thing came ashore at night, and things rapidly deteriorated. And within a matter of maybe 15 minutes of that eye wall approaching shore, these relentless, powerful winds were causing power surges everywhere and knocked out the power. And, so I was right there, dead center, eventually in the eye as the eye wall moved ashore and got into that calmness of the eye. And it's very eerie after such a horrendous, harrowing experience. And then to get this calmness with nothing happening, but knowing that, about to ride it out again, the backside of the storm is about to come ashore. So it was, that being at night, the strong winds, no power, you can't really see anything. It's quite a terrifying experience.
I can only imagine, and I know that it was a little difficult in terms of some of the technology that you brought along with you. Now, is there something that you learned from dealing with Laura that maybe you'll take with you into future hurricane seasons?
Yeah, so with these hurricanes, especially these big ones with the big time winds and it's wet everywhere you're at. It's wet. You can't escape the wetness. If you want to actually experience the storm, not inside of a building, you want to try and get into the elements a little bit. Being safe that you're protected from flying debris, because that's the main concern really, is flying debris. But it's wet everywhere, and it knocked out I use a lot of my cell phone actually for a lot of coverage when I'm in the field for the in the moment stuff, trying to tweet out to the world, be like, here's what's happening, showing people what's happening. And my phone got taken out by the just water intrusion. And so, I've actually had that happen in the past. So I was a little disappointed in myself that I had a plan to resolve that problem in future hurricanes, and I didn't do it before Laura, but I have done it now. I carry 2 cell phones now, both with cell service, so that I can keep in contact with the rest of the world. And I have 2 different providers, so to have a little bit of redundancy there in my technology.
Well, we are glad that you're safe. And of course, as we get ready to wrap up and put a bow on 2020 and look ahead toward 2021, it looks like you have already done a lot of the groundwork, being nice and insulated with that beard as we get into winter, because I know with your videos from last year, it was pretty chilly in some of those locations. So we cannot wait to see the video that you send to us this winter.
Yeah, I mean, I love chasing blizzards as much as anything else. There's the tornadoes and the hurricanes. So about time hurricane season starts, that's when I start letting the beard grow out. By the time hurricane season ends, I can roll right into blizzard season.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. Our best, of course, to you and, of course, your new family. Congratulations, of course, in order to the birth of your son. But again, all the best to you and your family. Thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Mike. We'll talk to you later.
She's asking about Hurricane Ada. So I'm going to read it off to you. She said Hurricane Ada moved into the Gulf of Mexico and it seemed to hit a wall and stop in its tracks, and then it turned completely in a different direction. What could be strong enough to stop a strong storm in its tracks and make it do an about face like that? So when we talk about steering currents, that's the primary mechanism that steers hurricanes, tropical storms. And the 2 big players are ridges of high pressure and troughs of low pressure. So with Eta, we don't have it graphically, but I can try to explain it to you. Eta came in and moved over Central America, and then was quickly diverted back into the Caribbean, and then moved up over eventually into Florida. So we had a powerful cold front that was coming into play that was a trough of low pressure. We talk about this when we go live a lot, that these troughs kind of just pick up these storms and shove them in the direction that they're headed. And in this particular case, cold fronts go from the western part of the country to the east. Home picked up Eta and moved it back towards the east. So it didn't do a sharp turn. You have to remember these storms are massive engines. They're usually 300 miles across. And they don't turn on a dime. It's not like you can, take a pen and just spin it like that. They take a lot of hours to turn. It may seem like it's a pretty dramatic shift, but they do take hours, if not days, to turn. So we have lots of time to watch them. But that's a great question, and that happened several times this year where we saw some pretty significant shifts in tracks as powerful cold fronts came into play, and also domes of high pressure came in from the eastern part of the Atlantic Basin, or actually from the western part of the Atlantic Basin, and moved systems back towards the west. Right?
So Leslie, we've got some other questions in here. Somebody asked, here it is. We've got Polar Altercations Gaming. He's been watching the stream for a little bit now. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it very much. He says that he doesn't plan on necessarily going into college, but is there any way to still be a part of the meteorological field? Well, it really just depends on getting the correct information. You don't just want to go online and look at information that is just coming out there from really any old source. You want to go to a source such as ours, or really an outlet that's going to provide you with accurate information. NOAA is, of course, a great resource to be able to look into, and especially as we came out of a season where so much was going on, you really want to be sure you're getting your information from the proper place. That's really important. And Stefanie and Leslie, someone in here asked, in terms of global warming and climate change, is there any potential impacts 25 years from now that we'll be able to see to hurricane season? What do you guys have to say?
Well, that's looking out there. But like we mentioned before in our packs that you just saw, one of the big players in this season was the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So what that is, we have these big scale climate patterns that really impact what we're seeing, like the La Nina that we saw come into the season part way, and those are larger scale impacts. So while it's not exactly simple to just say yes or no, in 2040 we'll have an active season, we do look to those larger scale patterns to help with our forecasting, and those forecasts you see come out in May to kind of progress for the rest of the season. So yeah, that's just, we are really writing the books here with 2020, but we hope that from here on out it's smooth sailing, and of course the summer's good we want.
Absolutely, and we heard from Dr. Bell exactly about how we're in this enhanced period. We're on year 26, and they can last as long as 40 years in these busy seasons. So you guys, there could be several more years, if even not a decade or more, that we could be in this enhanced season. So another question, Stefanie, was about the Dvorak. I thought this was a really good question. Do you want to explain a little bit about what the Dvorak scale is?
So when we're trying to track the storm's intensity, there are many tools that the National Hurricane Center will use. And one of those is the Dvorak technique. So this is where they use infrared satellite imagery to take that visual. They have a scale dependent on that visual scale to measure the intensity of that storm. It goes to a number that starts with a T, so a T1 to a T8. So if you're closer to that 8, you're typically dealing with those big monster buzzsaw-looking kinds of hurricanes, which at one point both Eta and Iota kind of had that view to it. And just a reminder, we do have the historical tracks in the MyRadar app, so make sure that if you have any questions, you can go back and recap this very, very busy season.
That's a great point, and it has been such an incredibly long season. I think all of us have a little bit of hurricane haze here because it's been such a long season. But we want to take just a couple of minutes here and offer our own impressions. It's been a long season for the three Mets here, but of course for everybody across the country. Mike, I'm curious if you have any takeaways from the 2020 hurricane season that stick out in your mind?
That is a great question. Well, for one, just you naming all the names there, I mean, we not only went into the Greek alphabet, but we went like way deep into the Greek alphabet. So it's easy to be able to go iota, wait, no, zeta, no, theta, iota. There's just so many storms. So if anything, I certainly learned a lot more Greek alphabet letters than I previously knew before. But I would say that my biggest takeaway really is just the rapid intensification really stood out to me, especially Hurricane Laura, that right up until landfall just seemed to be going and going and going, and just to see all those buoy readings coming in, I mean, really a sight to see. So for me, the rapid intensification, particularly late in the season, will be something that I'll be watching next year for sure.
Stefanie, I'm curious, you and I did many of the hurricane landfalls together. Laura in particular was a landfall around 2 a.m. I'm curious, some of your, she and I were doing the live updates. I'm curious some of your takeaways from this season.
Well, with all the records that we've broken this year, 2020 officially beating out 2005 for a number of named storms. And you think back in 2005, we didn't have the digital space, the social media that we have today. And in 2020, we do. So it's easier to stay connected, even with COVID, where a lot of us are distanced, not only physically, but oftentimes within our communications. Really being able to relay information and keep other people safe and keep people up to date with the exact things that are going on with these storms so they can be prepared.
I think one of the biggest takeaways is kind of what we've all talked about. For me, is just the sheer volume of these storms, and it is very difficult. We heard from the specialists from NOAA that it's often hard to really focus on one storm because there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the heels at a time. So it was an extremely busy year. I think the biggest thing that sticks out for me is the late season activity. This swing that we had between October and November, and having a Category 5 hurricane in November in the Atlantic Basin. That has happened in the Pacific Basin, but it's pretty rare in the Atlantic Basin. It's never happened this late in the year. So I think that's the thing that sticks out to me was Hurricane Iota. But there's so many. We'd be here all day talking about it. But we are closing the books, you guys, knock on wood, on the season, and we're looking ahead to the end of the year, and there are a lot of stories to tell from 2020. Mike, we have a special one coming up, don't we?
Leslie, we have to guess that a few of those hurricanes might make the list, but for those of you watching, be sure to join us on New Year's Eve as we take a look at the top 10 weather events of 2020. Again, it premieres New Year's Eve right here on MyRadar. You can watch across our social media channels, or of course, right on into the app. That's going to be very exciting putting that list together. Leslie and Stefanie, no shortage of weather events this year to add to that list.
And we just want to thank you again for taking time to join us. We know it's busy, we know you're busy, and we hope if you were not able to join us live today that you will come back and look at this broadcast. We put a lot of time and effort into it, so I want to give a quick shout out to Davey McFarland and Matt Hyland, who were up all night putting this show together for you guys. They did a fantastic job, as well as our producer, John Garrity, keeping us all sane. So, again, thank you again for joining us, you guys, and hope you can stick around to the very end for our big show at the end of the year.
And remember, of course, to get social with us, you can see those names on the bottom of the screen there. Be sure to follow us across all of our social media platforms. And of course, as you saw during this particular season, we were incredibly active. We're easy to reach out to. Follow us there, and we'd love to chat with you.
And of course on YouTube, if you're watching already, click that bell. That way you never miss any of the content we're putting out. We have lots of exciting stuff coming on in through the pipeline into December.
All right, you guys, on behalf of meteorologist Stefanie Lauber, as well as meteorologist Mike Linden, I am Leslie Hudson. I want to thank you again for joining us, and we unpacked this incredibly rough and raw 2020 hurricane season. We are glad we are all here and we have survived it with you. We look forward to seeing you in 2021, hopefully not quite as busy. That first outlook from NOAA will come in May. Thanks for joining, you guys. Stay safe.